Peering out from the dark shadows of America's death row are the faces of evil. The faces of murderers. Men and women who commit the most heinous of crimes. Men and women who often evade capture for years, decades. But eventually, these lowest forms of humanity find themselves on death row, awaiting their final fate: execution. This is the story of the ultimate punishment, death, and the portraits of the worst who were put to death by the feds and the states in America. In this program, we will look at the history of capital punishment and how it became America's harshest penalty. Since the founding of the colonies, almost 16,000 Americans have departed this life, not at the mercy of chance or natural causes, but subject to the will of the state. These are men and women who found themselves on America's death row. Men and women condemned to pay the ultimate price for their crimes: death. The history of capital punishment in America is a long and bizarre story. It started when the first colonists arrived in Virginia in 1607. Captain George Kendall was accused of being a spy for the Spanish. Fearful that if set free, Kendall would reveal the weak defenses of the English colony, the council executed him by firing squad. The first person executed by capital punishment in America. Dr. Daniel LaChance has studied in depth America's history of capital punishment.
The history of capital punishment dates back from the founding of the first colonies, so Jamestown in 1607 and the Plymouth and Mass Bay colonies shortly thereafter. In most of our historical knowledge about the death penalty comes from colonial New England, where you had better record keeping. And what we found is that in some ways capital punishment was similar to that as it was practiced in England, in that you had public executions that drew large crowds. You had execution for offenses that today we would be surprised to see anyone even get a small jail sentence for. You know, everything from fornication to pickpocketing was a capital offense in the 18th and early 19th centuries.
But what's most surprising is that during America's founding, the crowds witnessing executions were not judging the condemned, but identifying with them, with the struggle between good and evil in all of us.
Today we think about people who are put to death as monsters. That's how the media constructs them. But in colonial New England, they were seen quite differently. They were seen as almost representatives of a sinful humanity that everyone in the community partook in. And so a lot of what you find in accounts of executions from colonial New England is not what we would expect today, a kind of horror at the crime that was committed, but a kind of identification with the condemned, a hopefulness for their redemption.
Of course, the most notorious cases of colonial capital punishment gone awry were the Salem witch trials from 1692 to 93. During more than a year of terror and bloodshed, 19 women were hanged accused of being witches. But the community was not identifying with the condemned in these executions, but participating in a kind of mass hysteria. An early stain on the history of capital punishment in America. When the United States of America was born out of the Revolutionary War, a debate arose over the use of the death penalty.
There's a real sort of division amongst the so-called founding fathers about the death penalty. Some saw the death penalty as a relic of a monarchical past, so that the death penalty was tainted because it was used by kings to execute people unfairly. It was a sign of their capricious power that the Republic was the opposite of. Others, however, saw the death penalty as being warranted even more so in a democracy than in a monarchy, because when one committed a crime in a democracy, one was not offending the sovereign, right, or a king. One was offending the people, right, because the people rule in a democracy. And so the gravity of the crime in some Revolutionary era minds expanded, it grew, because one was now disobeying laws that had been democratically enacted, and so the punishment was thought to need to be more severe.
Dr. Paul Litton knows that this great ambiguity among the Founding Fathers made its way into the United States Constitution.
We do know that the framers contemplated the death penalty when writing the Constitution, because the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution says that no one shall be deprived of their life or liberty without due process of law. So by stating in the Fifth Amendment that no one can be deprived of life without due process of law, we know that the framers obviously contemplated the death penalty. Some folks argue the answer is easy. It's fair to assume that the framers thought it was okay for someone to be put to death as long as that person was provided due process. However, others argue that it's an open question whether the death penalty is constitutional, precisely because, right, the Eighth Amendment says there shall be no cruel and unusual punishment. Is the death penalty cruel and unusual? Right? Some argue it should be an open question. Judges should decide, is it cruel and unusual, and not simply ask, did the framers think it was cruel and unusual? And so some people argue that it's an open question whether it's constitutional. We should decide for ourselves whether or not the death penalty is cruel and unusual.
Needless to say, the death penalty remained the ultimate punishment in the U.S. So, as the years progressed, so too did the idea of execution as a public spectacle. In the 1800s, executions were an excuse for spectators to get drunk, rowdy, and, ironically, commit crimes. In response, the states began to change their venues of execution. Michael Radelet is a professor of sociology at the University of Colorado. He has studied the spectacle aspect of execution.
People thought that the death penalty was a deterrent, and therefore they wanted public executions. In many states, public executions occurred on Fridays, the same day that Jesus was said to have died on the cross. Schools were closed, parents brought their children, teachers brought their kids, and they would go downtown in a given city to a public square, and there they'd have a long, long spectacle of public hanging. This could go on for 2 or 3 hours. Sometimes there was a choir, sometimes there was a band. The man on the gallows, as we're usually by hanging, usually would give what was called an execution sermon, where the person would stand up on the gallows and denounce alcohol and women and whatever contributed to his crime.
There's this feeling that these executions have become carnivals. So you start to see elites worried that these crowds are potentially taking the wrong messages away, but also that these crowds could become, in some instances, sympathetic to the condemned and interrupt the ceremony, or if they were highly upset by the crime could try to administer their own kind of punishment against the condemned. And so there's this fear of chaos and disorder that slowly emerges over the course of the early to mid 19th century that in essence makes the elite say, we can no longer trust this crowd, and in fact, rather than maintaining order, these executions could actually be sowing disorder. And so we've got to do something about them. And the solution was to put them inside the jail yard at first, but crowds would find a way. People would gather in droves around the gates of the jails. Children would climb up in trees and look over the walls to see the hanging. People would go up onto rooftops to try to get a glimpse of the event. And so it's this cat and mouse game until finally these executions are put into the bowels of prisons.
And the last state to do that was Kentucky. Their last public execution in 1937, there were about 1,000 people who attended that execution.
Indeed, executions moved from public places near where the crimes occurred to private interiors of state prisons. The officials administering the punishment were no longer local sheriffs, but nameless state agents carrying out the deed on behalf of the aggrieved. And thus, the modern American death row was born, a bleak, isolated place where criminals convicted of the worst crimes imaginable await their demise. However, the manner in which the condemned would die would change as America progressed into the 20th century. The Iron Maiden, stoning, crucifixion, quartering, hanging, buried alive, burned at the stake, the guillotine. These early and violent methods of execution still haunt the imagination. Though some were adopted by the new colonies, one prevailed as the most popular: hanging. In fact, well over 9,000 American criminals have been executed this way. A rope is tied to a gallows or a tree. Then a noose is placed around the guilty person's neck. The support is removed, leaving the criminal dangling from the end of the rope, strangling to death.
For most of American history, the primary method of execution has been by hanging. Cheap, you needed no skills, you would put the guy on a horse under a tree branch and swat the horse, and the horse would take off, leaving the guy behind. It turns out it's very difficult to hang people. If the drop is too short, the person strangles to death, and that really grosses out the crowd. The guy is dangling for a half hour, and because they were public, oftentimes the person's family and friends were witnessing it. And we've got all sorts of examples where people from the crowd would rush up to the gallows, grab the guy on the ankles and pull him down to put him out of his misery more quickly. Or if the drop was too long, the person's head would fall off, which of course grossed everybody out too.
So from the late 19th century till today, we have this really interesting pattern. I call it dark optimism. There's this adamant feeling amongst elites in the United States that we can perfect the technologies that we use to put people to death so that they won't feel any pain, and so that their death will not appear to witnesses to be gruesome, to be violent, to be similar to the crimes for which these people were being punished. That's always the challenge for people carrying out an execution, is that the violence that the state is administering against a person who's been sentenced to death cannot look like the violence of the criminal wrong or the crime that the person had done to put that in that position of being sentenced to death. You don't want to confuse the righteous violence of the state with the lawless violence of the criminal.
A new technology showcased in the 1893 Chicago World's Fair would give the powers that be a new, humane form of execution: electricity. In 1889, William Francis Kemmler grabbed his trusty hatchet and chopped his wife, Tilly Ziegler, to death. After a little more than a year on death row, on August 6, 1890, Kemmler became the first man in the world to be executed by electric chair. Sitting on the chair, head covered, Kemmler muttered, "Take it easy and do it properly. I'm in no hurry." But the event was far from flawless. After the first jolt, doctors mistakenly declared Kemmler dead, only to realize he was still alive and gave him another 2,000 volts, twice what he had before. The smell of cooked flesh and singed hair filled the execution room. Not exactly a stellar way to usher in the age of the electric chair. 56 years later, a young black man, Willie Francis, took part in the biggest botched electric chair execution the country would see. In 1945, Francis confessed to shooting a Cajun pharmacist, Andrew Thomas, an old employer. A speedy trial ensued, and Francis was sentenced to death by the state of Louisiana, despite the fact that he was underage, only 15 at the time of the murder. On May 3, 1946, Francis walked what he thought was his last mile to the Louisiana State Penitentiary's electric chair, gruesome Gertie. But Gertie had been improperly set up by a drunk security guard and his inmate assistant. Francis screamed while the volts shot through his body. The switch was flipped off, and very much alive Willie Francis went to the infirmary. Though Francis appealed all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, a 5-4 decision sent Francis back to the chair. On May 9, 1947, after only a year and a half and one earlier failed execution, Willie Francis was successfully executed. But most inmates are electrocuted without a hitch. Of the over 4,000 electrocutions carried out in the U.S., less than 2% were botched. But the gruesome accounts of the few botched electrocutions were still enough to steer elites toward a new, more humane method of execution.
If there's too much electricity or it's not done right, you have to give several jolts. There's worry that if the person was not dead after the first round of electricity, somebody would have to order a second or even a third round.
The electric chair people who are burnt, or where it takes 20 to 25 minutes in repeated shocks to put them to death, smoke rising from their body, filling the execution chamber with a putrid smell. You see, in response to that, not a kind of, we can't get this right, we need to abandon the effort to make executions humane and not have them altogether, but a kind of dark, optimistic feeling that we can develop something different that will have fewer problems.
That something turned out to be the gas chamber. The use of a poisonous gas that causes the victim to suffocate to death. The first such execution took place in the 1920s. Born in China around 1895, Ji Zhan was a roaring 20s gangster, part of a violent Chinese gang. In August 1921, in Mina, Nevada, Ji murdered Tom Chong-ki, a member of a rival gang. Ji was quickly apprehended and sentenced to die by Nevada's newly approved method of dispensing death: lethal gas. Officials originally tried to pump gas straight into his cell, but it didn't work due to leakage. So, on February 8, 1924, in this room at the Nevada State Prison, Ji Zhan became the first person in the United States to be executed by lethal gas in a chamber. But the crude chamber was poorly sealed, and witnesses reported smelling the deadly gas. Nonetheless, after 9 minutes, Ji Zhan, the cold-blooded gangster, was dead. but improvements had to be made to perfect the gas chamber.
And between 1923 and 1956, 13 states adopted the gas chamber, and when they invented it, they were not things that you could go down to the Home Depot and buy. So there was a manufacturer in Denver that made boilers. Today we call them furnaces, but big industrial boilers to heat up buildings. And with a little revamping, they made these boilers into a gas chamber.
Lethal gas has been used to dispense justice to some 600 death row inmates. But being gassed is a horrific experience. First, the accused is strapped into an austere metal chair. Then, a pellet of potassium cyanide is dropped into a bucket of sulfuric acid. This reaction creates deadly hydrogen cyanide gas. The condemned can stay alive as long as they can hold their breath, but once they suck in that first taste, the gas eats away at their lungs until suffocation. A hideous way to lose one's life. Then at the state penitentiary in Huntsville, Texas, on December 7, 1982, Charles Brooks Jr. became the first man in the U.S. to be executed by lethal injection. 6 years earlier, Brooks took a used car on a test drive with the lot's mechanic, David Gregory. Brooks then picked up his accomplice, Woody Ludre. The two callous criminals threw Gregory in the trunk and drove him to a nearby motel, where they bound him to a chair with coat hangers and gagged him with tape. History will never know which killer pulled the trigger, but Gregory was shot once in the face and died instantly. Police found the used car parked outside the motel and arrested Brooks and Ludre. Though both had been targeted for the death penalty, only Brooks received the ultimate punishment. On death row, Brooks converted to Islam and even fell in love. But nothing could keep him from being strapped on a gurney and rolled into the death chamber. Robert Keller has written over 70 true crime books. He describes what happened next.
The execution team will be preparing behind the curtain. The prisoner will be brought in and strapped to the gurney by wrists and ankle restraints. A heart monitor will be attached to his chest, and he'll then be wheeled into the actual chamber on the gurney and positioned in front of the viewing window. The execution team then inserts 2 intravenous tubes, one into each arm. The tubes actually run from there through an opening in the wall into another room where the execution awaits. So neither the spectators nor the prisoner will see the executioner. Once the tubes are inserted, the executioner flicks a switch and a saline solution begins to flow into the tubes. The curtains are then drawn back to allow the witnesses to view the execution. At this time, the condemned is allowed to make a final statement, which is usually recorded and will later normally be released to the media. The warden then gives a signal and the executioner releases the cocktail of lethal drugs into the IV tubes, and within 2 minutes after that, the prisoner is normally dead.
But lethal injection, like every form of capital punishment, can go horribly wrong. On December 13th, 2006, it took Angel Diaz more than 40 minutes to succumb to his injection and 2 doses to bring him down. It was later discovered that the needle had passed through his vein and into his arm's soft tissue. On September 15th, 2009, Ramel Broom had his own terrifying experience.
Executions via lethal injection can go terribly wrong. So several years ago in Ohio, a man was brought into the execution chamber and they could not find a vein to start the IV line that's necessary to administer the cocktail of drugs that puts someone to death. And they tried for 2 hours poking and prodding him in different parts of his body, trying to establish access to his vein, and they eventually gave up. And he was taken away from the execution chamber, brought back to his cell, and is still on death row with new appeals as a result of his experience in the execution chamber. So the historical trajectory of execution technology has been to continuously strive to develop a pain-free, civilized form of putting someone to death. But we have never been successful at doing that. Right? So 3% of all executions have been botched since 1890 when the electric chair was developed. But in the last 40 years, as lethal injection has become the dominant mode of execution in the United States, we have an 8% rate of botched execution. So Americans have gotten worse over time at putting people to death, even though we've become we continuously insist that we can do it in a way that's painless and humane.
In all, lethal injection has been used on more than 1,200 condemned Americans. Like the so-called evolution of execution technology, so too there is a progression of the types of crimes punishable by death. Today, there is really one crime that sends criminals to death row: first-degree murder. But in the early days of the nation's history, murder wasn't the only crime that could send you to your death. In the 1600s, capital punishment could be dealt for such crimes as stealing grapes, killing chickens, and trading with Indians. Trivial reasons to meet your fate.
In the United States, we've had not only death sentences, but also executions for all sorts of crimes, and really all sorts of crimes up through the 20th century, up until about 1970. People were sentenced to death and executed not only for murder, but for rape, for robbery, burglary, train robbery, horse theft was a capital crime, perjury in a capital trial, kidnapping, which especially a number of laws were passed in the wake of the kidnapped murder of the baby of aviator Charles Lindbergh in 1931, but just really scores of capital crimes. And the whole history in the United States, and really worldwide, has been a history of limiting the death penalty.
This limiting can be traced back to one man, an Italian criminologist and philosopher, Caesar Beccaria.
When the Constitution was written in the United States in the late 1700s, there was an Italian philosopher named Caesar Beccaria who had written a very influential manuscript called On Crimes and Punishments. And it really is the birth of the anti-death penalty movement. Beccaria argued for restrictions of the most severe types of punishment, not only the death penalty, but also forms of torture. And he also argued that the only time that the punishment should be used was if the person was so uncontrollable that if the person continued to live, that she or he would be a danger to other people. So that manuscript influenced the founders of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. It's probably most visible in the Eighth Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment.
Beccaria's humanitarian text got the attention of Dr. Benjamin Rush, an original signer of the Declaration of Independence and founder of the Pennsylvania Prison Society.
At the time, most states had mandatory death sentence for all homicides, but Pennsylvania restricted it by differentiating murder into first-degree, second-degree, and manslaughter, and the death penalty was only available for first-degree murder. But there have been further restrictions throughout the century, so that today, for homicide at least, which is the only capital offense, it's still less than 1% of all homicides result in a death sentence.
The abolitionist movement gained momentum, And in 1846, Michigan was the first state to do away with the death penalty. Wisconsin and Rhode Island soon followed suit. However, with the Civil War in full swing, the abolition of slavery took center stage, and interest in repealing the death penalty waned. Today, the death sentence is still legal in 31 states, and the worst capital offense, state or federal, is still first-degree murder, the most heinous crime imaginable. Gradually, over the years, only the worst of the worst would be sitting in their dark, solitary death row cell. But though the powers that be had the best of intentions, when it came to the death penalty, disastrous problems lay just beneath the surface. Problems with who was really being sentenced to die.
During the 20th century in the United States, we saw increasing restriction of executions. The year with the most executions was 1937, 1939. In both those years, we had 199 executions in the United States. However, there were concerns about how systematically it was applied. Are we really getting the worst of the worst? One example is rape. Between 1930 and 1967, there were 455 people executed for rape, and 90% of those people, 405, were black men with white victims, so an obvious racial disparity. And overall, between 1930 and 1967, there were 3,857 people executed, and 54% were black. So there were a number of appeals in the 1960s brought because of the obvious racial disparity. Black people were getting executed for what would be, today would be like a manslaughter, homicides that, like a barroom brawl. White people, before they were executed, had to kill 2 or 3 people.
Death row inmates and humanitarian organizations alike continued to push for equality in death penalty sentencing. Finally, in 1972, a landmark case, Furman v. Georgia, made it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court.
In the case Furman versus Georgia, the claim before the court was that the death penalty was being applied in an arbitrary and capricious manner, meaning juries were not given criteria to use to decide who should get death and who should not get death. Rather, when someone was convicted of a capital crime, for example, murder, it was up to basically the jury to decide life or death, and the jury wasn't given any legal standards to use to decide life or death. And the death penalty wasn't being used all that much. And so what the death row inmates argued in the case was that the death penalty was being applied arbitrarily and capriciously. We didn't know why some folks were getting the death penalty and some weren't, because there were no legal standards. And to bolster that claim, they showed, look, very, very few people, even among the pool of murderers and rapists, very few are getting the death penalty. There's no explanation why some of us got it and most of us did not. And in 1971, the Supreme Court actually rejected that claim under the Due Process Clause and said, no, the arbitrary imposition of the death penalty does not violate the Constitution. But a year later, the court changed its mind and held that the Eighth Amendment does ban the arbitrary and capricious use of the death penalty. And so the court, therefore, struck down all death penalty statutes at the time, even though it was not taking the death penalty off the table for the states.
So, it was up to the states to decide. If they wanted to keep the death penalty, they had to come up with a way to level the playing field.
Well, if the problem that the court found in 1972 was that juries were given were unguided discretion, well, how could states respond? Well, if the problem was unguided discretion, either states could provide juries guidance, give them standards to use, or they could take away discretion and make the death penalty mandatory. And both of those avenues were taken by some of the states. So many states, like Georgia, decided to let juries decide life or death, but they gave juries standards. So they gave juries, here are reasons to give the death penalty. If, say, for example, there was torture involved, or the person had killed before, or the victim was a child or a police officer, and they gave juries reasons to give life, mitigating circumstances. Other states, like Louisiana and North Carolina, decided to take away all discretion from the jury and just say if you were convicted of the highest degree of murder, you get the death penalty.
The Supreme Court weighed these two avenues in two important cases in 1976, Gregg v. Georgia and Woodson v. North Carolina.
The Supreme Court approves systems in which juries are given guidance. So in other words, the court said, you know what, if juries are given standards to use, standards that are supposed to pick out the worst of the worst, we're confident that these new statutes will not lead to arbitrary sentences. Giving juries standards reduces the risk of arbitrary sentences, and therefore we're going to uphold these schemes. At the very same day, the court decides Woodson versus North Carolina and holds mandatory death sentences do violate the Constitution for a number of reasons. One, a mandatory death sentence doesn't permit the defendant to give reasons why his life should be spared. A mandatory scheme doesn't treat the defendant as an individual. And there were some other reasons as well. The court was skeptical that mandatory death sentences would actually do away with arbitrariness, because even where there's a mandatory scheme, juries might decide not to convict somebody of the highest degree of murder, knowing that death would be the punishment. They might decide on their own to maybe convict the person of a less serious crime. And we won't know why, because we won't know what standards the jury used to make that decision. So the court said mandatory schemes don't get rid of the risk of arbitrary distribution of the death penalty.
And that begins what we call the modern era of death sentencing in the United States. So since 1976, there have been just over 1,400 people executed. We no longer find a race of defendant effect in most jurisdictions, but it turns out that the race of victim makes a huge difference. Given a similar homicide, you're between 3 and 4 times more likely to be executed if you kill a white person than if you kill a black person. So that means that if you kill a white cop, you're more likely to be sentenced to death than if you kill a black cop. If it's a double murder, more likely if they're white victims than black victims. If it's a rape murder, more likely if the victim is a white woman than a black woman.
In the modern era, there are many other complaints about the death penalty. Poor representation can land a one-time killer on death row, while a more depraved murderer with a good lawyer can get life in prison. The average death row inmate spends 16 years on death row in near isolation before finally being put to death. Are they the same person when they reach the lethal injection chamber? Have they changed to the point where they are no longer a threat? In terms of money, trials seeking the death penalty can cost several $1 million in legal fees for both sides. Far more than the cost to keep an inmate alive for the remainder of his or her life. Finally, for decades, people have thought that the death penalty would deter potential murderers from perpetrating their monstrous crimes. But researchers are finding that life in prison can be far more of a deterrent, that killers are more afraid to spend several decades in prison than be put to death. No matter the issues surrounding the death penalty, America's fascination with death row has never been greater. Indeed, there is still a mystique surrounding the condemned waiting to die on that last mile. The cold cell, hidden in the dark, forgotten corners of the prison. A prisoner, isolated from the rest of the world. Doomed to a never-ending solitary confinement. The ghosts of the damned still seem to haunt these lonely rooms. What is America's fascination with death row? Perhaps the need to know what happens in the life of a death row inmate goes back to the onlookers of executions in America's early years. Indeed, it is a voyeuristic interest.
Well, I think our curiosity about death row comes from the fact that we have essentially disappeared inmates who are convicted of capital crimes into these prisons that are many, many miles away from the community in which the crime occurred. Americans in general have this fascination, a kind of voyeuristic fascination with what happens in prisons. You can look at everything from prison films to television shows to documentaries that really sort of promise to take viewers into the prison to give them a real experience of what it's like behind bars. But of course, you know, folks who study media have long said that the ways in which, documentary films are made, that television shows are shot, very much reflect a very particular viewpoint and are often delivering to viewers what the viewers are expecting to see. So what we know about life on death row, what we know about life in supermax facilities, is that it's profoundly boring. There's a kind of death row syndrome that a lot of scholars have documented, where over time it becomes increasingly difficult for people who are in solitary confinement or who live in a single cell and have very limited human contact to retain their sanity. There's a kind of institutionalization process, a numbing that happens to the self as one is kept in isolation on death row. And of course, it's only gotten worse because the time between sentencing and execution has grown incredibly long.
Gary Jobe was a prison guard at the infamous Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City, Missouri. He knows well what a day in the life of a death row inmate is like.
When you're on death row, of course, you know, you're locked down at least 23 hours a day. They do have to let you out to take a shower, clean up. They do have to let you exercise. So there was provisions made where they could exercise for an hour, of their 24-hour period when he's locked down. Now, another thing they did allow them to do was they would allow them to do work on, in fact, they even had some, which we'll see in just a minute when we walk up there, some cells where they would let you go in there to work on your case. Death row inmates were constantly working on their case. They was always trying to come up with something, some kind of appeal, something to change the outcome of their death penalty. So they would give them an opportunity to, and they'd also give them access to books, law books, that they could study the law. And in fact, some of these guys were actually almost lawyers before they died, because they had studied so much law and wanted to know all their rights and what have you. And so they would actually become very well versed in law before they actually was executed.
Next, Gary Jobe gave us a tour of the haunting Missouri State Penitentiary. The first glimpse is of the austere intake building, where death row inmates are given their last look at the free world as the iron door slams shut. After intake, they continue to Housing Unit 3. As you walk in, a large labyrinth of corridors, staircases, and cells sprawl out. But prisoners on death row see little of this bright, open expanse of the prison. They are sent straight to the basement. Gary Jobe explains.
When I come up to this door, of course, this is going down into the ADSEG units and the death row units, and so I'd have to bang on the door and get the guard's attention, and I'd have to tell him my name and say what my business is down in death row or in ADSEG. So he would pop this door here, and then I would walk down inside. You'll notice that it's actually a double hallway that's separated by bars. Now, the actual cells here on the left was the actual death row cells, and you can walk inside here. And of course, when they would bring their food to them, or whatever the case might be, they would actually go on the inside. And if you'll notice, it's a double security here. Not only is this very secure here, but we also have another cage out here where if there's any way that they might overpower a guard when they or if they open the door, then they was not out in the outside. They was still locked in this cage, because that door would still be locked, and they would be actually contained in this area here. As a death row inmate, of course, you were locked. Naturally, you was locked down for 23 hours a day, and unless you was working on your law case, and then of course they didn't have to let them go out in population and take showers, because they had the shower area right here. So all they'd have to do was take them out of their cell there, then they'd let them out of this cage. These doors would be closed as well, and so there's still another cage here. So all they would actually leave is from their cell into a big cage, into a smaller cage, into a shower area. So they actually could take their showers without ever leaving the area. They'd take their showers right in this area here. I know at one time when we moved them to Potosi, Missouri, we had a total of 70 inmates on death row at that time. Now there was times back before we moved them that the numbers approached 90 or 100 people on death row at one time.
The Missouri State Penitentiary, also known as the Walls, opened its cells in March of 1836, making it the oldest functioning penitentiary west of the Mississippi. At one time, the Missouri State Pen was the largest prison in the country, housing 5,200 inmates. In 180 years, 40 inmates would walk this lonesome, friendless corridor, walk their last mile to the gas chamber and death. Next, Gary leads us through this ill-fated last mile.
Of course, all executions are at 12:01 midnight, so it's about 11 o'clock at night, and we're going to take this inmate here who is on death row. Tonight is the night that he'll be executed at 12:01 midnight. And so we'll take him from his cell here, and we're going to take him out this door here. Okay, we bring the inmate through here. Now, these doors would be unlocked they would be electrically unlocked by the officer in the cubicle here, in this cage here, and he would then these doors would be locked down. Now we'd have about 4 or 5 officers escorting the man on death row, the inmate on death row, and so we'd be escorting him to go up the steps. Now the officer in this cage area would actually have to pop this door here so we could open this door and take him up these steps. And we would walk up through here. Of course, that door back there would be locked. This door would have to be popped, would have to be unlocked by the officer in the cage, and then we could come out this door. Okay, this is the door we'd bring the inmate out of, and we'd escort him down the steps, and we'd have a vehicle waiting here with the warden in the car, because he's the one that's going to be doing the execution. We would actually place the inmate in the back seat, and he would have leg irons on, he'd have handcuffs, and we would actually help him into the car, and we would secure him in the car, and then we would shut the door, and then we would drive down to the gas chamber.
Next, the condemned would drive through the gate that leads to the dreaded gas chamber. It sits in a small, unassuming building, a building you would never know was the site of countless executions.
And then we would open the gate up, and he would actually walk right down this path here. We would escort him down this path right here, and we would walk, this was known as the final walk on death row, and so he would walk be escorted down this walkway. And then there was a symbolic cross here that would make inmates think about what they had done and what they were facing, and so they would have to actually step across or over the cross as we take them down to the actual chamber. We'd have to open the outside door up, and then there's an inner door that's also locked too, and then we'd bring them in here, and there's actually a holding cell here, and we would place the inmate in this holding cell for 1 hour prior to the actual execution, and then the execution would occur at 12:01, 1 minute after midnight. And you might note that on the wall over here, of course, this is a phone that the inmates always wanted to hear ring, because this is the actual phone that if they would get a stay of execution, they would call on this phone. The governor would call them on this phone to say, hold up, we've got new evidence, whatever the case might be, do not perform the execution. So that phone ringing would be a very pleasant sound to the inmates here in this cell waiting to be executed in less than an hour.
Now the hour of their death is at hand. The inmate is escorted to the ominous chamber itself, a terrifying tomb for all who entered and never came out alive.
Now you'll notice there's 2 chairs in here, and the reason for that is because the very first execution was a double execution, and so they set it up for 2 inmates. But in most cases, it was just actually a single execution. The inmate would be escorted in here, he'd be placed in the chair, and he would actually be strapped in. They actually strapped him to the chair, strapped his legs, and they would blindfold him. And he would be sitting here waiting till they decided to pull the red lever on the outside of the gas chamber. This chamber we're sitting in, by the way, is out of a World War I submarine. They had to have something that was airtight so that they could contain the gases in here, because there was it's no longer hooked up, but when it was hooked up, there was actually a mechanical mechanism that would drop the cyanide pill into one of these big vats, a big heavy vat on the floor here, and it would set underneath the chair, and it would actually drop the cyanide pill. When he pulled the red lever on the outside of the gas chamber here, they would pull that lever, it would drop the cyanide pill down into the acid, that would form a gas as substance, and then the vent up above would be shut off, and it would fill this chamber with gas. Now they would knock on this window right here when he was ready to drop the pill, and so the inmate would know they're ready to drop the pill, because he'd be blindfolded, so he couldn't see what was going on. And so he would sit there when they would knock on the window, when they'd peck on that window, then he could take a big deep breath of air. As long as he could hold his breath, he could live. But as soon you can only hold your breath for so long, and eventually you're going to have to take a big deep breath of air in. And when you do that, you're going to take all that into your lungs, and it would be it'll start eating your lungs up. So it wasn't a very pleasant death. The death penalty in the gas chamber was not very pleasant. The other option was, if he wanted to get this over faster, he could start breathing quickly and just get it over with. And so that was the inmate's choice, what he wanted to do.
A truly ghastly end for a ghastly crime. With any luck, their execution has brought some solace to the loved ones of the victim. But the long wait was finally over. And in the end, the killer paid for their offense with the ultimate price, their life. In the U.S. today, on average, more than 3,000 inmates sit on death row. And around 30 each year will actually be put to death. But ironically, most of the condemned will never walk into the execution chamber. Some inmates have inhabited these cells in a kind of solitary confinement for more than 20 years. Their existence defined by the 4 walls surrounding them. A punishment many would say is worse than death.